Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network, a division of the Multiple Sclerosis Global Support Network. The following program broadcast is an original creation by the broadcast entity. Discussion within the following broadcast should be used for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice or consultation. Before considering application of any broadcast content in the following program, please consult your healthcare provider. If you feel you are having a medical emergency, please contact your local health services for immediate assistance. MS&Me Media and the Multiple Sclerosis Global Support Network do not guarantee or warrant the accuracy of information in the broadcast to follow. The Multiple Sclerosis Global Support Network provisions broadcast services to program hosts. Information discussed in the broadcast does not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or goals of the network and are solely those of the show broadcast host. Should you wish to host a broadcast, please visit our website at msmemedia.com and submit a request to become a program host. We thank you for listening to the MS&Me Radio Network. Enjoy the show. Welcome to MS&Me. Today's interview is with Dr. Chase Spurlock, CEO of IQuity, developers of the Isolate MS and RNA blood test for multiple sclerosis. Welcome, Dr. Spurlock.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, so honored to have you here. We have really been looking forward to this interview. We have so many questions from our followers on this new blood test. Now, multiple sclerosis can be difficult to diagnose. Symptoms are nonspecific and mimic other diseases. This can result in multiple physician visits, multiple tests, and months or even years for clinical evidence to be gathered, and then your doctor has to reach a definitive diagnosis. What do the IQ Isolate test measure, Dr. Spurlock?
Yeah, so thanks again for having us and for the opportunity to discuss our technology. And at the heart of these tests is a focus on RNA. And RNA is something that you may or may not have heard of. And it allows you to determine a real-time snapshot of what's happening inside the cells at any given moment. And so our testing looks at RNA expression, and it looks at how your genes are turned on or turned off, and it looks for patterns. And we've identified certain RNAs that are indicative of MS or are consistent with MS in our research. And there have been significant, computer advances over the past 5 or 6 years even, and we've harnessed those advances and in the technology referred to as machine learning. And when we look at our data sets and we look for patterns, we can pull out an MS pattern with very high levels of accuracy, greater than 90%, for multiple sclerosis. And what we find is that this provides a new level of information that providers haven't had access to before. And we all know that MS is a clinical diagnosis, and doctors are trying to put a story together about whether or not the clinical signs and symptoms, as well as imaging studies and laboratory investigations, are consistent with multiple sclerosis or not. And invariably, this takes time, as you alluded to, and we're trying to do all that we can to get information into the hands of these providers who are making these decisions. So this is another tool in the toolbox that they can use as they try to diagnose their patients.
So your test would not replace the traditional MRI and spinal tap?
I think that with any new technology, it's another tool in the toolbox, and this is a new innovation, and it's information that they haven't had access to before now. And we've seen a great evolution in the diagnostic tools for multiple sclerosis, and it ranges from anywhere from clinical signs and symptoms, over 50 years ago, to use of evoked potentials and spinal fluid analysis, to inclusion of the MRI. And this is just another tool that doctors can leverage. And I think that we've researched this for over a decade now. Work was started in the lab under Dr. Tom Awney at Vanderbilt, and this work has reached what I refer to as critical mass, where these RNA patterns that we can detect provide actionable information. And so I think it's an exciting time to give new information to doctors.
That is fascinating. And, when the funding began, from the National Institutes of Health 10 years ago, I'm sure you couldn't even have imagined a 90% success rate. That's just amazing to me. It's just fascinating. Now, could a patient have a pattern consistent with the disease and not have the disease?
So we've actually focused on, and we've done a number of different clinical studies to try to build a pattern for what multiple sclerosis looks like and what other diseases might mimic, the signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis, so other inflammatory neurologic diseases. And what we find is that the pattern we pull out for MS is specific for MS and is dissimilar from other, healthy individuals or other inflammatory or non-inflammatory neurologic diseases. So, we were very systematic in our approach by looking at a diverse set of different patient populations, and we find that the detection of this particular gene expression signature or RNA pattern is specific for multiple sclerosis.
Now, Dr. Spurlock, yes. Now, Dr. Spurlock, for our listeners who are only familiar with, say, DNA, can you explain the difference between RNA and DNA?
Right. Well, I think, this is a question that comes up very often. And, I was at a conference a few months ago, and one of the statistics that was told to us at this particular conference was that 95% of human diseases can't be diagnosed at the level of DNA. Changes in DNA are indicative of only a prediction, or a risk for developing the disease. You might have a risk factor for developing a particular disease, but then the disease will never be manifest. Yeah. And so just because you have an alteration in your DNA code doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disease process. You're not experiencing a disease in your body at that particular moment. RNA takes it a step further, and it allows you to capture a snapshot of what's actually happening inside the cells of your body at a particular moment. And that's a particularly useful bit of information. And by being able to deliver that to the doctors, we can say, based on the patient's molecular portrait or the molecular profile today, this is what we detect as happening inside the patient's body. And, it's a level of information that has been somewhat underappreciated until now.
Yes, yes. Now, how early in the disease progression can multiple sclerosis be detected?
So we actually looked at that, and through a collaboration with the Accelerated Cure Project, we recruited samples at the time of a clinically isolated syndrome, and then those patients were tracked for later conversion to clinically definite multiple sclerosis. And we found in the majority of those patients, greater than 90%, that we could detect multiple sclerosis at that first clinical time point, which leads us to believe that this RNA pattern that we see is present even at the earliest stages of disease. So at the time of a CIS, we can give information to the provider to say that this looks like multiple sclerosis. Alternatively, and as the Brain Health Time Matters in MS report highlights, general recognition of MS in the population and referral to a MS specialist can often be delayed. So if a provider has the reason to suspect MS, he or she can order this test, and if it comes back as a positive, they can then expedite a referral into those people who diagnose and treat multiple sclerosis. And I think that could be a significant time savings for the patient and represent a clinical benefit to the patient.
And then early diagnosis of the disease itself can be very important to the patient clinically. So that's a very good point. Now, how long does it usually take to get the results?
So to get the results, basically so our test has to be ordered by a healthcare provider. And so there would have to be a reason to suspect multiple sclerosis. So the patient would have to present with signs and symptoms that are suggestive of multiple sclerosis for this test to be appropriate. And once the test is ordered, then so the doctor places the order, then a blood draw is then performed, and the test is sent to our lab. And there are a few logistical steps there. And once the sample hits our lab, we will have the result back to the doctor in as little as a week. And so it's a fairly fast turnaround on the lab side. And I think that is, very helpful, to the doctor, and it would allow them to have information as fast as possible.
Yes, for those of us who have waited years sometimes, being observed and trying to pinpoint which demyelinating disease we are fighting, that is very significant. So that is amazing to us. Now, how?
Yeah, I think I think that.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to clarify one point there, I think that we need to emphasize that this is a clinical diagnosis, and that just because you have one doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a yes or no diagnosis for multiple sclerosis. Right. But we're committed to delivering this particular piece of information to the doctor as fast as possible. But it's up to the provider to make the call on diagnosis.
Correct. And that's a very, very important point, because some people, when this came out, they thought it would be like a standalone test. You receive this result, and that just means 100% you have MS, and that's what it is. And of course, as we know, MS is a very complex disease, and this is one very important piece of the puzzle, this test. And then, of course, they do their neurological testing. They do MRI sometimes. MRI, depending on what part of the world we're talking about, of course, protocols are different. That brings up a very important point. Is this test available outside of the United States at this point?
It's not currently available outside the United States at this point, but we've had a number of inbound inquiries from abroad, and we actually have a number of patients that have expressed interest in visiting the United States to have an appointment with a trained neurologist to talk with them about offering the test and performing the blood draw.
We've had a lot of international interest from our because we are a global organization, and we have had a lot of feedback asking when it would be available outside of the U.S. So hopefully this will get the word out there, and everyone will start asking about that in their country. Now, how accurate are these results? We've heard 90%. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So in our clinical lab, not only through our research and the validation process throughout our research, but also in our clinical lab, which is based in Nashville, we have documented greater than 90% accuracy, and that's for the ability to distinguish multiple sclerosis from the other experimental cohorts that were in our studies. And you can learn more about that by visiting our website.
Yes, definitely. Can you give that address out for everyone, and then we'll also include it on our social media as well?
Sure. It's www.iQuity, IQUITY.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for providing that. Now, I believe you touched on this before, but we want to press upon how important this was in the process. On how many patients around the globe did you base your algorithms?
So we actually looked at multiple sites in the United States and at least 2 sites in Europe. And so what we found was that the gene expression signature that we could detect, or the pattern that we detect in American cohorts, was actually consistent with the European cohorts. And if you shuffle the deck, as it were, and you mix the U.S. patients with the European patients, we found that the results were similar. And so therefore, the pattern that we detect is fairly robust.
Now, are these tests covered by insurance?
They're not currently covered by insurance, but we're actually working to seek commercial reimbursement for these tests. So it's a patient-paid test.
Oh, wonderful. Do you have assistance programs for the patients who cannot afford them?
We do. And so when your doctor orders the test, you'll then be prompted as part of our patient portal to apply for the financial assistance program if you wish.
Wonderful. So for which other autoimmune diseases have you developed tests?
So we're focused primarily at the moment on 3 branches of medicine for our IQ Isolate platform, and it encompasses neurology, gastroenterology, and rheumatology. And so in neurology, obviously, we've focused on multiple sclerosis, but then, autoimmune disease in the United States affects, 50 million Americans, and, that's right up there with heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And, we don't always think of it in those terms, but, it affects a large percentage of the American population, and it's really an underserved community. And, we're committed to delivering diagnostics to that community. And other investigations in gastroenterology have focused on inflammatory bowel diseases, for instance, Crohn's and colitis, and then being able to distinguish these inflammatory bowel diseases versus irritable bowel syndrome. Which is not an autoimmune disease itself, but it presents, especially early in the disease, similarly. Then in rheumatology and also in pain management or primary care, looking at fibromyalgia syndrome, which is not an autoimmune disease, and then comparing the patterns that we see at the level of RNA in fibromyalgia syndrome versus rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and other rheumatic diseases. So we're very excited about the pipeline and very excited about being able to deliver blood tests that can help doctors, pinpoint in their patient populations those that have a gene expression pattern consistent with a particular disease or not. And, beyond, our IQ Isolate platform here, we're also interested in evolving patterns. And once a patient is diagnosed, being able to monitor how that pattern changes over time as the consequence of treatment, so that doctors can have a real-time heads-up display of what's happening at a genomic level inside their patient's body.
That's fascinating. I guess I could have just been your one test case for all of them. I have lupus, MS, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, everything you were ticking off there. I'm like, I could have helped you with that. It really is exciting and fascinating because having so many autoimmune diseases, I'm so familiar that the agonizing process sometimes to get that diagnosis and to have more tools to fill in those pieces of the puzzle and cut down on that diagnosis time. When the press release came out that this was finally going to, that we just had cheers in our patient forums. We were just so excited. So we, on behalf of all of them.
Whenever we write these grants, this is something that, Tom and I have talked about, and then other, members of the scientific team here, we discuss all the time. We always talk about, the significance of the grant, and we talk about the patients and, trying to make a positive difference in the lives of the patients. And so many patients have, stepped forward and helped us in this research by giving blood samples and giving up their time. And I'm telling you, we couldn't do it without them. So, I know we actually thank them, more, for their efforts, because it wouldn't have been possible.
And that does bring up a good point, when these opportunities do come up for us to participate, to be part of the solution. It's really important that we step forward, whether it's they're just polling us, on this patient surveys can really provide a lot of information. And then, of course, the trials and giving blood samples. And it's just so important to fill in those pieces of the puzzle that we so need. Now, is there anything that we can do as patients to get these possibly covered by insurance, to make sure this test is more widely available? Is there something we could do on our end?
Well, I think that, I always encourage patients, if they're trying to, reach a definitive diagnosis, to have a conversation with their provider. And, information is key. And, I talk to a lot of neurologists, and, they're incredibly busy people. And it's sometimes difficult to hear of the latest and greatest technologies, and or any new technology for that matter. And so being able to take our information and talk to their provider about it, and have that conversation, I think is always the first step that we counsel patients to do. And so I think that helping us raise awareness that there's this new information that could be available to the doctor, I think would be very, very helpful.
Okay.
And I think that I think you hit the nail on the head, and that is take an active hand in research, because there are so many new technologies that are coming online. We're in the era of big data, and being able, we have the ability to perceive so many more facets of disease than we ever thought possible, and to generate more data about a single patient than we ever thought possible. And from my vantage point, just over the past 6 or 7 years, data science and clinical data, the possibilities have just grown infinitely. So it's a very exciting time to be in medicine, and I would encourage all patients to take a hand in research and helping us as researchers help you as the patient.
It's so eloquently said, and we just want to express our thanks once again, Dr. Spurlock, for you being here with us today. We will give more information out on our social media. We will have information from Julia Polk, who also works with you there at IQuity, and we will make sure that the website and that other contact information is there. We will encourage patients to have that conversation with their physician, and we are just so grateful for the work done at IQuity and the continuing research for other conditions as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have an amazing afternoon.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful afternoon.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's anything that we can clarify, just feel free to reach out.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I'll just send it to Kathy, all the communication, and if
Sure.
there's any questions or any additional quotes that you would like to send by her for me, for my article, from Julia or from yourself, just let me know anything we missed.
All right. Thank you so
All
much
right.
for your time. Really appreciate it.
You too. Have a good one.
All right, bye-bye.
Wonderful information from Dr. Chase Spurlock. Now I wanted to turn to my story, my personal story and journey with MS diagnosis, and then we'll bring on a patient from one of our patient forums to give her perspective on this test and how it would have impacted her diagnosis. Personally, I have been living with multiple sclerosis for 39 years. So I was finally diagnosed with PPMS active. That's primary progressive active. It took many years to get a proper diagnosis. I have everything from a range of, oh, it's just related to your lupus, or it's all your thyroid, pinched nerves. It is, all these other autoimmune diseases. They said transverse myelitis, neuromyelitis optica. Oh, maybe it's spinal cancer. All these things that were very scary, very long waits. So you would go and get the testing. You would have to go back to your family, back to your job. Try not to concentrate on what very scary diagnosis you might be getting. All at the same time, you were thinking, I just want answers, just so we know how to treat this. So although you're afraid of what diagnosis you may receive, at the same time running through my mind was, what am I going to do when I get that final answer? Could it be something so horrible that changes the course of my life more than all this disability and symptoms that have shown up over the years have already changed my life? I have 2 young children. They're 7 and 9 now, but At the time that I was going through the greatest part of the testing, they were 2 and 4. So think of the impact that it could have had cutting down on that wait time, having this as a tool to say, okay, this is what it is. That's what we saw on the MRI. That's what we saw on the spinal tap and the neurological exams and the optic nerves and the VER tests, all those things, nerve conduction studies, all these things, that one blood test would have went, yep, okay, 90% accurate. This is the icing on the cake, and this is what we're dealing with. So now let's go toward a treatment path. So having that happen for an MS patient can be so impactful, so impactful, and cutting down on all that worry and stress and the unknown. And, I was told once I could not return to work. My doctor said, no, you can no longer work. The rumors start. I heard my coworkers had said things like, oh, she just quit work to stay at home with her kids and lay on the beach all day. So all those hurtful things that you hear because you don't yet have that final diagnosis to say, yes, it's definitely this. This is what's causing this. They hear, well, I'm still going under testing, and they've changed it from this to this, and the suspicion starts like, well, just what is it? We just want a name. People just want a name, and you can't always give that to them, at least not right away. And it can be a very frustrating process. And you're scared the whole time. Well, what if I have one of these, scary attacks again and lose a bunch of function, or something else crazy happens to my body and they don't know, and they don't know how to fix it because they don't know what it is. And at the same time, you're almost thinking, well, if it does, maybe they'll figure it out. So it's a heart-wrenching process. It's a very scary process for some of us. Some people are very lucky, They have definitive lesions, definitive disease activity, no other comorbidities that are muddy in the waters, and they get that answer right away. So they have a very quick diagnosis process, but not all of us are that lucky. Not all of us are. And it brings up another subject I want to discuss before we get a patient's personal perspective, our children. Many of the parents in our forums have said, well, would you get your children tested? If you have MS and there's other, people in your family who have MS, your children start, showing symptoms, or even if they don't, would you ask your doctor to order this test just to be sure? And not all doctors would, order a test like this without calls, without other symptoms. However, in my case, my 7-year-old has already had a case of optic neuritis. So now I'm thinking, is there a way to get the money to have my son tested? If we knew this early, with the new treatments that are out there, the great results that you get, the sooner that you start treatment, what would be his outcome, in opposed to let's just wait till a lot more damage is done and he gets that final diagnosis. So that is definitely a conundrum for a lot of parents now too. They're thinking, if my child or even adult child has, an incident, a clinically isolated syndrome even, optic neuritis, any of these things, do I push for that blood test? This is a real choice. And without it being covered under insurance, it's a financial choice. And for me personally, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth saving his function. He's such a young child. He has such an amazing life ahead of him. And if we can get on top of this right away, I think it'd be worth it. So I'm seriously considering that choice. And I know a lot of other parents might want to do that now as well. I just urge you to look into it, do your research, and talk with your doctors. That's what we need to do. The more we speak with our doctors, this test gets known. People have this, as the choice in their diagnosis plan. And I think that's so important that we have more choices, that we can take control and be our own health advocates. That's so important, that we are our own health advocates. And that's why I really wanted to bring you this information today. Because you can see this in forums and see the address and go, oh, that sounds pretty cool, but I bet there's not really a blood test for MS, or I would have heard more about it. I would have heard, oh, everybody would be talking about it constantly. But sometimes people don't, because they don't get that information. There's so much information that comes out at us through social media. We become a little jaded sometimes, and we don't always believe the next story that we see, like, oh yeah, right, just one blood test, 90% accurate. How's that possible? But it is possible. That technology is here now. We have come to that point. So now we make those decisions. Do we get this test? And do we pay for it? Remember, like he said, there is financial assistance available. Contact them. Do your research. Let your doctor send that order if it's appropriate in your case, or if it's appropriate in your child's case, and you see, how am I going to face this financial burden, and you start working that out. Because if it's important enough to you to cut that diagnosis time, it might be worth trying to figure this out financially. I've seen GoFundMe's for it. I've seen GoFundMe's, and a Crowdfire and all that. And they have raised the money, or through family and friends. They've raised that money and they've gotten their diagnosis early. So I've seen some amazing success stories. We wanted to bring you the perspective of people who hadn't had that, and would they have made a different choice? Because obviously the patients who have and got that, early diagnosis, we can assume, of course, they're happy and, happy with their decision. But I wanted to talk today about those tougher questions. If you didn't have this, as an option to you, would you have done it if you had it? Would you do it for your child? So those are tougher questions, especially with the financial aspect. But I just want to encourage you guys to open that conversation, have that dialogue, bring it up to your doctor. If you don't have that diagnosis, definitely do your research. And we're going to talk next, with a patient who did not have that available to her. And she has progressed very fast at a very young age. So I think this, in her case, might have made, who knows, a difference in treatment path. We really don't know. Hindsight's 2020. And we don't know all of her, medical issues. But this is something I want to open a dialogue on. Get this information out there at the patient level. Let this be a tool for them. So get that word out there, and next we'll switch to speaking with our patient. But keep thinking about that. Remember, IQuity.com, and we will make sure you get all this information as this story develops. And we get more information in our news story that will be circulated as well to get this information out to the MS community. And now we turn to an interview with a patient living with multiple sclerosis. We welcome Angela Johnson to the show. Welcome, Angela.
Hello. Nice to be here, I guess.
Yeah, we wish we didn't have to be considered a patient with MS. But
I couldn't hope.
I know, right? But I'm so grateful that you could be here with me today. Now, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your MS diagnosis story?
Well, I went on a fair ride July 14th, 2012. And 2 days later, I had double vision. I couldn't stand up straight. It just got worse. I went to the neurologist, and 5 MRIs before they diagnosed me, a spinal tap, and a full body CT. I was diagnosed October 30th, 2012. I don't know if I blame the fair ride for bringing it out, or if I'm happy that it told me I had a problem.
That's true. It's kind of a double-edged sword, when we discover that trigger, and they start investigating. It is like we're glad that they're looking for what the source of the problem is, and we're almost glad when we get the diagnosis because we know what we're dealing with. However, we don't like that answer. multiple sclerosis.
I didn't
Yeah,
even know what to say when I got the answer. I just kind of sat there confused.
confused. Yeah, you need more information to process it. Now, you said you had 5 MRIs trying to get a diagnosis?
Yep.
The
5. They gave me one a few days after they first saw me, and then I asked what was on the MRI, and she said that was artifact because they came up strange. So she gave me another one, and another one, and another one, and another one.
And you had a spinal tap as well, you said.
Yes.
Now, did that come back positive for the O-bands?
Yes.
At least you got a positive. I ended up having to have 2. I had one that was inconclusive, so they did a second one, which was not fun. Not fun at all having to have 2.
No, the first one isn't fun. The second one, no, I'm good.
Even less fun. Now, we have been talking to the doctor who helped develop the new blood test, the RNA blood test for multiple sclerosis. It's 90% accurate, and it's going to be an additional tool in addition to the traditional tests like you and I had, the MRIs and the spinal taps and the neurological exams, optic nerve scans and all the other tests we go through. It is not covered by insurance though yet. Would that be something that you would have considered if it was offered back then, trying to raise the money for it yourself?
If I had to, I'm at the point where I would have done anything when I got really sick.
Yeah, it would have been worth it to get those answers for you.
It would have been.
Yeah, I feel the same way. In my case, I think I agree with you. It would have been worth it to stop the cycle of, tests and appointments and confusion and disappointment and just wanting to know. Now, when they did finally get your diagnosis, were you diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis?
Yes.
You were. Are you, how advanced is your disease at this point?
A few weeks ago, I was told I'm secondary progressive.
Secondary progressive. And that's a very hard transition to make.
It is, because it's 5 years and I've gone from RRMS to progressive.
Yeah. It's very quick, and it's not a lot of time to really process that. Now, do you feel like you'll have to go through a mental process now with the new diagnosis, like you did the first time, kind of like a grieving process for a change?
I cried like a baby.
Yeah, I understand. I did the same thing when I went through the process of being told that I was severely advanced. So when I passed that threshold, I went through it all over again, just like when you're first told.
Yep.
So I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Now, do you think that patients that you've talked to would probably say that we would pay for this test, try to get our families to help us raise money for this test, even though it's not covered yet by insurance?
Probably.
Yeah, I think our community would probably agree with you. I just wanted to get your perspective, as a patient. Is this something that we think that, in our minds, would you, with the 90%, would you, in your mind, would you trust it as like, oh yes, if I get a positive, that's it, I have multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, probably, because it took me 4 months before I got the diagnosis.
Yes, with what's available now, and I agree with the company that has developed it. I agree that it's something that I would do in addition to. I would probably have the MRI, and I would have the spinal tap and that test. Just to be sure. I think that.
Yeah, because there's always doubt.
Yeah, there's always that doubt.
My husband, it took him 2 years before he decided that this is actually what I have.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it would help our families, because the tests we have available to our community now, they really leave a lot of conjecture. There's so many things that could be at the root cause of these symptoms with multiple sclerosis and many autoimmune diseases. And I think having a blood test, an RNA blood test, it really would end a lot of the conjecture and sometimes criticism that MS patients and other autoimmune disease patients go through.
Oh, yeah. It would definitely help.
I think so too. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really wanted to get your perspective as a patient, and I so enjoy you in our MS&Me Ladies group forum. It's just a blast in there, and so much support for everyone.
Yes,
And
it is. I joined it about 2 weeks ago.
yeah.
Because I just need someone to talk to sometimes.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm always here. If you need extra support, you just let me know, because I just think you're a dear person, and I'm just so blessed to have you in the group.
Hey, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. You have a wonderful rest of your day, and we just thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Angela and I are both in our 40s, and we're living with progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. They have severely debilitated both of us, and we both, as we spoke of, would have had possibly a much shorter diagnosis. We're pretty sure we would have shorter diagnosis period if we would have had this test, 5-10 years ago. So we are both, thinking, because I've chatted with her off the offline, and we were both thinking that this is really a game changer. This is a wonderful tool for multiple sclerosis. The patients now will have much shorter diagnosis times, which means they will get treatment faster. She and I have both had, such damage that we have lost use of limbs. And to possibly, with better treatment, faster treatment, prevent that from happening to those out there who are facing MS diagnosis now and have this tool at their reach, we do feel is a game changer. So I agree with my friend Angela. It really is important. And I too, like her, would have raised the money to have that test done, to be, the next tool in the arsenal to confirm, to, get rid of any conjecture on the part of my physicians, so they know how to treat, to move forward, to prevent any more damage if possible. So I really do believe this is a game changer. So I am so grateful that I was able to speak with Dr. Chase Spurlock today, the CEO of IQuity, and Julia Polk, who is also giving information toward this interview and my research behind a news article that I'm writing on this subject. So I'm really grateful that they could be with me and talk on the phone with me on this subject. Now, if you guys want more information on this test, you can go to iQuity.com. That's IQUITY.com. And you can get more information on this test. But keep in mind that your doctor must prescribe and order this test for you. It will not be covered by insurance at this time. Hopefully that changes in the near future. And since we are a global audience, this at this time is only available in the United States. I hope and pray that changes very quickly and that this is a more widely available test. Remember that this is not just a test by some company out there who developed something to make money off of MSers, which I've heard, comments like that on social media. This is a test that was developed through technology studied at Vanderbilt University Medical Center for more than 10 years with funding from the National Institutes of Health. This is a very important test and a very important tool. So we need to get the word out there about this as patients with multiple sclerosis, so other patients know this is available to them, so they can ask their doctors about it just in case their doctors have not heard about this test. That way they just have another tool in their arsenal to get that quicker diagnosis. Stop more damage more quickly if possible. And I hope that tests like this that will give us a quicker diagnosis will one day lead to tests for all autoimmune diseases, other conditions that patients just struggle for years and years trying to figure out which autoimmune disease is it. Do I have lupus? Do I have Lyme disease? Do I have MS? Do I have fibromyalgia? What do I have so I can get proper treatment? Years of lost employment, not knowing and not being able to get a proper treatment. Years of, ridicule sometimes from others. What is wrong with you? I don't think there's anything wrong with you. Is she lazy? Is she trying to get out of work? So there can be a social factor in this for patients living with multiple sclerosis. So I think having that clear definitive test like Angela and I were discussing would cut down on a lot of that we see and expressed in patient forums. So I really encourage you to also visit our website, www.msandmemedia.com. That's www.msandmemedia.com. There you will also see more information on this test. You will see my interview in written form, additional quotes and information from both Julia Polk and Dr. Chase Spurlock. I will provide that for you on our social media as well. Now, I do encourage any feedback you guys have, any opinions on this. So go ahead and do that on our social media accounts, on our Twitter, which is at MS&Me Radio. We also have our Instagram at MS&Me Radio as well, and on all of our social forums like Facebook groups. So we do invite your feedback on this test, on whether you would raise money yourself to have this test done, and if you've had the test done already and how it impacted your journey with MS diagnosis. So we really would love to hear your feedback on this, and help us spread the word. Help us spread the word on social media and forums so patients know this is available. So I will be sharing that article for all of you guys. If you want to share it with your friends and family and let them know that this is available. Many of us, unfortunately, do have more than one family member who is either showing symptoms or has been diagnosed. And of course, they might want to get this out to other family members in that case. So definitely follow us on our social media and we'll get that information out to you. So like I said, I do want to just once again thank Dr. Chase Spurlock. He is the CEO of IQuity, and of course Julia Polk, who has given us background information on this process and the discovering of the IQ Isolate test that measure the RNA biology that has led to the blood test for multiple sclerosis. Also like to thank my patient guest again, Angela. She's just such a dear person in our groups. She is just newly joined our forums, and we have just struck up, such a real relationship through social media forums. And I think that social support, like she said, is so important. Not only can you receive support and information, you can find out things like this, treatments that are available, things to ask your doctor about. So I think that social media forums can do so much, especially if they are well controlled and vetted and supported social media forums, where you make sure that the information is correct and that the patients are really supported and in a controlled, protected environment, so they can share such private information as to get their support for their journey with multiple sclerosis. So thank you all for joining me this week. Join me again next week at the same time, right here on MS&Me Radio Network. And we'll bring you another interview. I'm just so excited to bring you these MS&Me interviews. I think it really bridges the gap between patients, clinical, and research. That way you can go ahead and share this information with their families and the communities, and we get information in a form that we can understand, and we get to ask the questions we've always wanted to ask. So thank you all for joining me once again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.